4-5, proving congruencies. Angle, side angle, and angle, angle, side. So the first thing we have to talk about is included side. The included side is between two of the given angles. And our first postulate we're going to talk about is angle, side angle. So it states that if two angles in the included side of one triangle is congruent to the two angles included side of the second triangle, then the two triangles are congruent. Okay. Alright, let's see what they mean by that. Let's look at this first example. Now, I wrote a little bit on this, kind of just indicating what they gave me for information. They said L is the midpoint of WE, so I just wrote that. That's the midpoint. So I know RL is going to equal LD, right, and WL is going to equal LE. The next thing that they told us is that WR here is parallel to DE on the other side. Okay. So when I think of that, I think of alternate interior angles because I've got this transversal. So RWL is congruent to DEL. I'm using this side here, this angle on that side. Okay. I could also use this side over here, RL and LD. I can state that WLR and ELD, those vertical angles, are congruent. So there's a few things in there. So let's see how I set it up, my explanation. So the first thing that I did was I said that W and E are alternate exterior angles, or alternate interior angles in this case, because alternate interior angles are congruent. Then I stated that WL is congruent to EL because of midpoint theorem. Then last, I talked about those vertical angles that I pointed out last. That angle WLR is congruent to angle ELD. The last thing I state, again, is that these two triangles are congruent to each other. Alright. So again, going back, you have an angle, you have a side, and you have an angle. Okay, so angle, side, angle. Alright. Next proof. Alright, you guys have this figure in front of you. Again, I'm just jotting down what I know. They told me that J and K, these two angles up here, are congruent. That JM is congruent to KL. Right? And the other thing I noticed is that N is reflexive. It's shared by both of the two triangles. What they want us to prove in the end is that LN and MN are congruent. So they're looking at the parts of the triangle are the same. So we talked about this earlier in another lesson, that we have the CPCTC, congruent, parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So we're going to use that to help us prove that these two segments are equal to each other. Once you prove the two triangles are congruent, then you can state that their parts are equal. So my first thing that I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about the angle. N is congruent to itself, reflexive property of angles. Okay, so I'll move this over so you can see. Next thing, part 2, I'm going to name one of the given parts, that NKL is congruent to NJM. Right, and that's just the reason is given. The next part, I state that KL is congruent to JM. So again, angle, angle, and I'm using angle, angle, side this time. Okay, something we haven't done before, but again, we can use this here. And then lastly, we've got to say, alright, now that I've stated my two triangles are congruent by angle, angle, side, I can state that those two side lengths, LN and MN, are congruent because of CPCTC. So I'll let you guys take a look at that. Alright, so if you guys could flip over to the next side. I've got one more example for you to do. And what I've done is, you read this, it says, when Mrs. Gomez puts her hands on her hips, she forms two triangles with her upper body and arms. Suppose her arm lengths AB and DE. So AB and DE are both 9 inches. And AC here and EF are both 11. They also tell you that we're just going to suppose that BC and DF are congruent to each other. They want us to determine that these two triangles are congruent to each other. So looking at this, right, thinking back to the different types of congruencies, right, you got side, you got an side, and you've got another side, you're going to use side, side, side congruency. Okay? So you state your 3 corresponding sides that are equal, so this one's equal to that, and so forth. Then the triangles are congruent by side, side, side. So that concludes this section.